What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video. And in this video, we got another tournament report. Another week goes by, another DM era tournament wraps up. I'm really happy to see all these different DM era formats get love that they deserve. And it's cool to see so many people putting so much elbow grease into pulling off these tournaments and making them run smoothly. So shoutouts to everyone who organizes these events. And let's dive in to the results from this latest tournament. Now, this was a Joey-Pegasus Format tournament, and I'm not like the hugest fan of Joey-Pegasus. I'm like, more an Android fan if I am going to play something from that time period. But Joey-Pegasus is interesting to look at in comparison to Android format, especially because there aren't really too many changes to the card pool. The main things that change is that you've got double Graceful Charity and Scapegoat and Sinister Serpent and Harpy's Feather Duster. Those are like the big differences, and those actually managed to change quite a bit. Now, will it manage to change how the meta actually looks? Well, we'll get into that. But I do think it is interesting because the format does play a little bit differently from Android format. A lot of people view Joey-Pegasus sort of as a format where, you can sort of get out of the tier 0 shadow of something like Tomato Control that Android format has and maybe try something a bit more jank and see success with that. I think that perception is partially true, but maybe also partially false, as we'll get into in these results. So let's dive into the results right now. Now, the deck type representation here, this is what Format Library had on their coverage. I'll link to the coverage in the description down below. And oftentimes, Format Library coverage of DM era formats can be a bit flawed because it classifies a lot of decks as Tomato Control. A lot of decks that aren't necessarily Tomato Control as Tomato Control as well. For instance, I joined this tournament. I played Exodia because, I figured it would be a fun deck to try out. You got double Graceful Charity, so maybe you can draw into it before your opponent can, rip your pieces out. So I figured it'd be fun to try. I didn't do that well with it. I don't think Exodia is really a deck that can win a tournament in Joey-Pegasus just because, you need to be pretty consistent over a long period of games to actually win. And I don't think that deck can really do that despite being able to win occasional matches here and there. But, my deck, the Exodia deck, is not on this wheel here, right? It's just 15 Tomato Control and 1 Recruiter Control. And, what is the line between Tomato Control and Recruiter Control as well? I do have an inkling as to what that Recruiter Control deck might be, as one player, Sebastiano, actually brought a very interesting sort of light banish deck. So they're playing Soul Purity and Light, and, they're playing monsters like, Shining Angel, etc., to get Lights Engrave, and then bring out just basically extension off the soul. So that's kind of neat. But I think that's probably the Recruiter Control deck that's being referred to here, but the rest of this, I don't know if it's all Tomato Control or if there's some mixing in there. So just take that with a grain of salt. It's always important to know that. And even though the results here may say this is a tier 0 format, I'm not necessarily sure it is a tier 0 format at this point. I think it's still a bit underexplored, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get a sort of similar metagame to how Android format is in general, with decks popping up here and there occasionally, but Tomato Control being the best deck in the room. And part of why I think that is because the top 2 decks in this tournament, and again, there were 16 people, so the, quote-unquote top cut, it's not really a top cut, it's a double elimination tournament, so, but, the amount of topping players whose decks Format Library shows off as sort of the topping players is just 2, because it's a pretty small tournament. And both those decks were Tomato Control. So let's dive into those real quickly, and then discuss my thoughts on the metagame as a whole. Firstly, the second place deck list piloted by JCVD. This is classified as Tomato Control, and I think it definitely does fall into that category. Sure, it's only playing 2 tomatoes, but this is basically the sort of standard good stuff sort of list that you'd see from something like Android format. Of course, when it comes to discussing these lists, oftentimes it comes down to special tech cards or ratios. For instance, here, JCVD is just playing double Kaiku, double Elf, double Bazoo. I think that's fine. I mean, you got the double Graceful to filter through your deck faster and thus get to these monsters more quickly. And that also means that you can play a lower monster count like this. And I think besides that, the deck's pretty standard. Double Trap Hole, double TT. That's also not necessarily a nailed down thing in Android format, at least, where people go back and forth on how many of these you should play. Trap Hole isn't as big of a blowout, but it does preserve your aggressive pressure compared to TT, which is a blowout, but also can lose you your monsters. I think in a format with Graceful Charities, the TTs are a little bit better because you can generally filter into whatever you need. So I think TTs generally come up more than Trap Hole does. Also with Duster in the format, if you're going to have a trap that's not chainable, you want it to be a bigger blowout than just a Trap Hole. But I do think a Trap Hole is still pretty good. And, I'm saying this right now, but the theory behind this has not been fully crafted for these decks. So I do think that maybe in the future we could see more Trap Holes or TTs experimented with here. But either way, I think the 2-to-2 ratio is fine at this point. Other than that, not really too much interesting to talk about here. I mean, this is just sort of a standard tomato control sort of list here. The side deck also like relatively standard. There's a Scapegoat in the side here, probably just trying to play around with that new card. It can come up against more aggro decks, but you know, I don't know. Scapegoat, I feel like it's kind of low impact in this format, especially when TTs are running around. So, yeah, it's just kind of not really seeing much play. And I think that makes sense because Scapegoat is a very situational card, and given the other power cards you have available to you, there's just other things that you can play instead. But, you know, this is still a very good list. If you want to pick up a tomato control deck list, that's sort of like pretty aligned with Android format, you can definitely play this in Joey-Pegasus if you want to try it out. Although you might also be better served by trying out the winning deck list of the tournament. So this is GBO's winning deck list for the tournament, and it's also tomato control. You know, there are some differences. GBO's playing 3 Mystic Tomatoes and only 1 Faith as opposed to 3 Faiths. Also, they're not playing Trapples. They're just playing Triple Jars of Greed instead, which I think is pretty good. Jar of Greed showing its power in Android format, and also in this format, even though you've got more draw power with the Charity, you kind of want the Jar of Greed to draw and do things like Charity to then, you know, get better draws later. So I think that makes a lot of sense, but, you know, they've also got the 2-2-2 Bazoo, Kaiku, and Gemini Elf ratio here. We got a pretty similar monster lineup overall. And the side deck even is like relatively similar, although there are, of course, some differences here. No Scapegoat in GBO's side deck. You know, they've got double Moth in the side deck. Yeah, I don't know. There's not really much to talk about here if you've seen my other coverage of Android format. Now, I'm not really spending too much time on these topping deck lists here. I think that either of them can serve you well if you want to dive into this format with a pretty standard deck. But I do want to sort of talk about, like, what does this mean for Joey-Pegasus format going forward? Because, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people have the impression of Joey-Pegasus format being a format where the jank decks that are sort of, like, pushed out of the competitive landscape in Android format can really find a home, because things like Graceful Charity can help a lot of decks across the board become more consistent. And so things like maybe Hayabusa OTK or Exodia or just other decks that you might consider playing could become more consistent in Joey-Pegasus. And I think this is true to an extent. Like, I would not be surprised if in future events, you know, maybe you see events with bigger top cuts, for instance, decks, you know, topping that, like, are a bit off the beaten path. I mean, we saw Sebastiano's deck list in this event. I mean, we don't have it publicly available on Format Library, but if you are interested in seeing it, you can actually get a membership at Format Library and see it there. But, you know, that's a pretty non-standard deck list, and it's very interesting to see that do so well, because it did make it to the winners finals, I believe, before getting locked out in the losers finals. So, you know, that deck clearly has some legs to it. But, you know, you've also got to keep in mind this was a relatively small tournament, so that deck would have had to play less games in a row and win less games in a row to actually make it to that point, right? And that's part of the thing that separates things like tomato control from the more rogue strategies that do get consistency boosts here, right? So if you've got a long tournament and you're trying to be consistent, like game after game and winning game after game, right? There will be some games, if you're playing something like Hayabusa OTK, for instance, right? Where you just don't draw as well as your opponent does. And because there's the presence of double graceful in the format, like, decks will be able to get a major advantage very early on if they draw better than their opponent, right? And a deck like Hayabusa OTK, that could honestly be a death sentence for, because that deck really does need to draw well to pull off its combo to actually win the game. Whereas a deck like Tomato Control, even if it is behind, and I'm not saying it will win when it's behind all the time, but it can sort of claw its way back because it's got a pretty good resource engine. You know, the Tomatoes maintain board presence. It can get into Sangan or Witch to search out a variety of things from deck. It can use its monsters as removal in addition to the powerful removal that it's playing already. And it can deck then even further with things like Jar of Greed if you're playing that in the deck as well. So I do think that Tomato Control is just generally a more consistent deck, and in these tournament settings where you do have to win game after game after game to actually reach the top cut and even win the event, I do think that Tomato Control will likely be the deck that wins the most games in these tournaments and will be a consistent tournament winner in the future. So I would sort of classify the Joey-Pegasus tier list as pretty much the same as the Android format tier list. Right now, again, you know, we have a very small sample set of tournaments held in this format, and most of those tournaments were pretty small already. That just makes things even harder to interpret. But I do think that, like, from what I've seen so far, it does seem like the metagames are basically going to be very, very similar. And, you know, maybe that means that the new cards don't really change the game as much as people expect. But I think it more means that on an individual game level, while things like Charity or Duster or Scapegoat or Serpent, while those cards may change things, like if you just play a random match here and there, right? I do think that on tournament level, it won't really change much. Now, that's just my thoughts on the format. Let me know yours down in the comments below. Do you think I'm right about this, or do you think that I'm sort of just cherry picking these tournament results and maybe giving a bit too much credence to the decks that won the top 2 positions? Let me know down in the comments below. I always love discussing these things with y'all. And also, if you like this sort of content, subscribe to the channel. We're trying to reach 1,500 subscribers. We weren't able to reach that in June. I'm pretty sure we'll be able to reach it in the beginning of July, and then maybe we'll go to 1,600 subscribers. But subscribing helps you know when I release new videos. It also allows the community to grow more, maybe make these tournaments a little bit bigger, and so maybe give us a bit more statistical certainty with these sorts of things. And also, if you want to support me directly, I have a Patreon linked in the description down below. If you join the Patreon, you get shout out in these videos. So big shout out to GMY Vets, Rinswin, Porkchop Coon, Tyler Compton, Dumptruck, and Brendan Donker. It really means a lot that you all support me this way and encourage me to make more videos like this in the future. If you want to play games in Joey-Pegasus or any other format that I featured on the channel, join the Discord link down below. I'll also link the Joey-Pegasus Discord server down in the description below if you want to join in on the next Joey-Pegasus tournament. But with all that being said, that's going to do it for this video. I hope that you enjoyed as always. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.